Well, it's great to see you today as we'll be wrapping up our Chapter 4 and reviewing for the test. We want to start out by getting organized, of course. Today you need Activity 4.5 and, of course, Test 4. On our agenda today, we are going to start with trade. We'll have an In the News segment. Then we will review Chapter 4. Your Test 4 is included in this lesson, and the preview for Chapter 5. Now let's go ahead and get started with our chapter verse. This is our last time to say it together. Genesis 1:27 and 28. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now I'm going to start out by finishing up our chapter. We left off with trade, and some countries try to be self-sufficient. That is, they try to produce everything they need without relying on other countries. They don't want to have to trade with other countries in order to survive. However, the world's wealthiest nations have a great volume of trade. Now, here are some terms that you need to be familiar with concerning trade. The market is the people or businesses who buy products. People market them to others. You'll hear it used that way. Sometimes market, I go to the market. But the market is actually your target, your consumers, those people who are going to buy your products. Imports is probably a review term for you. These are goods received from other countries. Think of imports. They're coming into your country from other countries. And exports, think of exit, leaving, exiting a building. Exports are goods shipped to other countries, so they're being shipped out of your country to another country. Another important phrase is trade balance. That is the difference between imports and exports, and we'll be learning more about that later in the year. Tariffs are taxes on imports and exports, and an embargo is a ban on exports. For example, a country might say, we're not going to sell any more of our product to you, and they do that for political reasons. For example, in, I believe it was the 80s, some of the Middle East countries put an oil embargo. They banned exporting oil, and that hurt the United States economy during that time period. But just as there are opposing views on economic systems, we have capitalism, and then socialism is an opposing view. There are also opposing views about trade, and we're going to learn more about them in the news.
And welcome back to World Watch. I'm your host, Mark Ward, and we're shifting gears now from the effects of modern technology on everyday life to free trade versus fair trade. Just a bit of history here on how we developed our practice of free trade. Tariffs dropped from a whopping 40% after negotiations to only 5%, and worldwide trade exploded shortly after World War II. This was due to the formation of the GATT rules, which opened up a free trade market. GATT, or G-A-T-T, stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So what does this mean for us as Americans? I see we have Jack from Texas on the line. Jack?
Glad to be part of this show.
Glad to have you. What do you have to say about free trade, Jack?
I'm a businessman and all for international trade, but there have been major problems with free trade. American businesses have to pay our workers well, at least minimum wage, and we have to provide good working environments and take care of them. But in other countries, businesses are allowed to pay low wages. They can use children, and sometimes even prisoners for workers. And many of their companies aren't under the regulations ours are to provide good working environments or control pollution.
So what you're saying, Jack, is that some foreign companies can produce goods much more cheaply.
And because of low tariffs, they can turn around and sell their products more cheaply here than what our own companies can afford to do.
And consumers, of course, are looking for a good bargain, so they're more likely to buy what's less expensive. Sounds like free trade hurts American businessmen. Karen from Maine, you're on World Watch.
Thanks, Mark. This is a topic I feel very strongly about. I agree with Jack. My husband lost his job because companies in other countries could make and sell products cheaper than his company. They were losing money, so they had to make cutbacks.
Sorry to hear that, Karen.
Well, unfair pricing by international businesses can be a real problem. Sometimes these companies will dump products here at extremely low prices in order to drive American companies out of business. I try to buy American-made products whenever I can now.
Well, that's one way to be sensitive to the issue. Ben from Nevada, what do you have to say to World Watch?
It might be a good idea to buy American products when possible, but I don't think we could say that protectionism is the answer.
Oh, wait a minute. Want to define protectionism?
Sure, that's when a country protects its own businesses by putting up restrictive tariffs for foreign companies shipping goods in.
And you're saying that's not the answer?
We've already proved it isn't. We had protectionist tariffs back in the 1920s to protect our industries from European ones who were rebuilding after World War I. That ended our international trade and hurt the economy.
Then after World War II, free trade became popular in capitalist countries, and that's when they came up with the GATT. But the results have been mixed for us, as Jack and Karen have pointed out. Jeannie from Washington, D.C., you're on World Watch.
Hello? Hello? Am I on?
Yes, Jeannie, you're on the air.
Wow, I'm so glad to be on your show. I listen to you all the time.
Glad to have you.
You know, I was just thinking, Mark, one good reason for international trade is that it lets us as consumers have a lot of products to choose from. It gives us a lot more freedom in that way.
Good point. We can pretty much buy whatever we want. Jonah from Florida, welcome to World Watch.
Another problem with free trade is piracy.
Oh, so there's still pirates out there. Seen any of those wooden-legged bandits on the high seas?
You know what I mean.
Well, for our listeners who might not know what you mean, why don't you explain modern-day piracy?
Well, it's stealing our ideas and products. Foreign businesses sometimes copy our things, like designer clothes. They'll make the same thing and put a fake label on it. So someone buys a pair of jeans that says Levi's on it, but it really wasn't made by Levi's. Or they'll make unlicensed copies of music, computer programs, and books, not paying the royalties they should to our companies. Free trade can be an unfair trade.
That's a good point. And that's why in 1987, 118 countries joined in negotiations to try solving unfair trade practices. Those negotiations ended 7 years later by establishing the World Trade Organization. And that's where we get into fair trade versus free trade. Penny from Ohio, you're on World Watch.
Hey, Mark. Great to be on your show.
Thanks. It's great to have you with us.
I just don't know about this World Trade Organization thing.
Why is that? I mean, they're there to make trade fair.
But individual countries no longer have the final say in their trade policies. This could lead to some problems with all this bureaucratic control, don't you think?
Well, you think the U.S. should withdraw from the World Trade Organization? Don't you think it's providing us some protection?
Well, yes, but
But you still have some concerns.
that's right.
Well, I think those are some valid concerns. Are we giving up beneficial freedoms by agreeing to managed fair trade under the direction of international bureaucrats? Well, call in and tell us what you think. This is Mark Ward on World Watch. We'll be right back.
Okay, so you've already read about fair trade versus free trade by this point, but that maybe sheds a little light on people's different opinions for you. And since World War II, free trade has become popular among capitalist nations, as we learned in this section, and the U.S. now leans more toward free trade than it does toward protectionism. And the World Trade Organization, you recall, was established to regulate world trade, but nations with common interest often form their own agreements. For example, the United States joined with Canada and Mexico in the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, just in 1993. Now we do want to take a few minutes to review our chapter. That was basically what we wanted to cover for trade. I think you did need to know about the purpose for trade. Obviously, nations want to trade to get raw materials that they don't have themselves so that they can be more productive. So it's going to aid in their prosperity. And also conflicts that trade can bring about. Well, for example, we mentioned the oil embargo where a nation didn't want to trade with us for various reasons, and those can bring about conflicts. The United States went into the Middle East during the 80s and also during the 90s for different reasons, but part of the reason we want to protect our interest over there is because they provide us with a lot of our petroleum. So trade in that respect, the different conflicts that come there can eventually lead to wars in some areas. All right, now we're going to go ahead and review what we learned in our chapter. And so you want to go ahead and get your activity 4-5 out. I wanted to jump ahead to this a little too soon. Terms from industry. Here are the terms, and you need to write in the word that the phrase describes. Identify the terms described below. So we're going to do as much of this together as we have time before you break for your test and the introduction into the new chapter. A type of farmer who produces only enough for his household. Subsistence farmer. A type of farmer who produces large cash crops for profit. Commercial farmer. Aluminum ore. Bauxite. A combination of metals such as steel. An alloy. 3 basic fertilizers: phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. Gaseous fossil fuel. Natural gas. Liquid fossil fuel. That's going to be petroleum. And mineral fuel. It's kind of tricky because it has to be inorganic. So it's not coal, it's uranium. The application of science to industry. Technology. Basic energy and equipment needs of industries. Okay, remember our 2 E's, equipment and energy, go with infrastructure. Any type of energy resource that will run out someday. Non-renewable. Sending messages through electronic impulses. Telecommunications. Type of business that buys goods in large quantities from producers to sell in smaller quantities to other businesses. Wholesale. Type of business that sells goods directly to the consumer. Retail. Money used to build industries. This is known as capital. economic system under which the government owns the major industries. Socialism. Economic system under which private individuals or corporations build most industries. That would be capitalism. The people or businesses that buy products from an industry. That is the market for that industry. Goods received from other countries. Imports, remember they're received into, think of into, imports. Taxes on imports and exports. Tariffs. An order from the Lord to subdue the earth. That's the dominion mandate. Subsistence husbandry. That is nomadic herding. Natural resources extracted by primary industries. Those are known as raw materials. The opposite of protectionism, free trade, and our last one, number 25, goods shipped to other countries. Okay, think of them as exiting your country. Those are exports. Exports. Okay, that finishes up your activity for you. I might have rushed a little bit if you were trying to write down every answer, but you should have been able to pop those off pretty quickly, and if you struggled, you might want to go back and review some of those terms before you proceed on to the test. Okay, and here's your test. As usual, it begins with multiple choice. Be sure to read each answer carefully. Look for italicized words like not. That might throw you off a little bit. That continues on to the back. You have matching section 1, then short answer. On to the next page, which has finishes up the short answer, another matching section, then on to true false. On the back, you do have a couple of essay questions, and these are not optional. Discuss the changes in agriculture over the centuries, and also discuss the industrial changes or revolutions since the 18th century. And they've given you plenty of room there. I wouldn't worry about necessarily filling up every line there, but just make sure that you start with a statement about a general statement, and then support it with specific details in the different aspects that you're talking about. All right, so now it's time for you to go ahead and get started with your test. Okay, you want to be sure to have a graded test before you continue any further. I'm not going to take time to go over the entire test, but most of it is self-explanatory. Maybe you just didn't remember something correctly. The page numbers are there on the answer sheet that your parents use to grade it. If you have a question, you can check with mom or dad to find the page numbers. But I did want to explain briefly the true-false and what is incorrect about the false answers. Number 39. GDP measures a nation's imports and exports. That is false. Page 79. GDP measures a nation's production or wealth. Number 40 was also false. Water and sunlight are non-renewable. False. They are renewable resources. Page 74. Number 43, infrastructure refers to a nation's trade balance. That is false. It is the equipment and energy needed to run any industry, and that can be found on page 72. Then your essay questions. Discuss the changes in agriculture over the centuries. Well, agriculture has been around since the very beginning. Adam was a gardener in the Garden of Eden. Remember that his sons worked in the two divisions of agriculture. Cain was in animal husbandry. That's divided into subsistence husbandry, like nomadic herding and ranching. Abel was a farmer. There are two kinds of farming: subsistence farming, growing just enough for your family, and commercial farming, producing cash crops to sell to others for profit. For most of world history, most people have been subsistence farmers. About the 18th century is when commercial farming emerged, and farmers with large cash crops were able to make excess money on their crops. Also, genetics and modern science have helped improve the yield of wheat and other grains, but diseases and insects have become resistant to modern chemicals. And you can look in your textbook on pages 61 to 63 to find out about agriculture, and also the section on the Green Revolution on page 65 tells us a little bit about that as well. Number 46, discuss the industrial changes or revolutions since the 18th century. Now, the first one we talked about was the Industrial Revolution from 1750 to 1850. It began in the textile industry in Great Britain, where they used machines run by steam engines to do the work more efficiently with fewer laborers. Then from about 1850 to 1900, scientists began applying discoveries in chemistry, biology, and physics to industry, which is called technology, right? The application of science to industry is technology, and that resulted in the technological revolution, or sometimes just called the technology revolution. Then important new technologies helped start new industries like electricity. The gasoline engine the engine led way to the automobile, and so on. Electricity especially enabled factories to be built anywhere. The automobile, of course, people could get back and forth to the factories. Then in the 1950s began the information revolution with the first computers, and they use now robotics, which reduces the needs for workers, and it's enabled the West to have a lot more service jobs than manufacturing jobs, because they had the corner on those informational technologies. And consequently, we're living now in what's known as the post-industrial period, where most people are able to work not on the farm or in the factory, but in offices and tertiary services. So you want to be sure to look up any answers that you missed or had questions on, anything that wasn't explained now or that you didn't check on before, because we are going to be building on concepts from these chapters throughout the year. We'll be referring back to these ideas, so you want to make sure that you understand them as well as possible. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is about society, and our main idea is that the world is divided into 8 cultural regions that have various demographic, which we'll learn about, and political characteristics. Goals for this chapter: identify the cultural regions of the world, describe the institutions that transmit culture, describe the 3 major periods of history and their effects on culture, use and analyze statistics in the study of human populations and their characteristics, describe the duties and types of governments, identify 2 international organizations, NATO and the UN, and tell why they were formed and what their duties are. Okay, so that might sound like, oh my goodness, that sounds so hard and so difficult, but it'll be broken down bit by bit, and I think you'll find that a lot of this is familiar information, things, everyday things that are around you, people that are around you, things that you're familiar with. So that should make it easier for you. If you've struggled with the first section that was about earth science and this section that was about economics, I think you'll find this a little easier, hopefully. Now, the family is the basic building block for society, and Genesis 2:18 records the biblical foundations of the family, so that is going to be our memory verse for this chapter. And you'll be glad to see that it's much shorter than the last few verses we've been working on. Let's go ahead and read Genesis 2:18 together. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make and help meet for him." And there are different sermons that have been preached on this, but basically that means I will make someone who can help him, who will be a helper to man. So God himself said it's not good that man should live alone. He created woman for the man, and that established the first family of history. Now, of course, you're going to be continuing to work on your geography island, and by now you should have several steps completed. You should, of course, have your island drawn and your copies made, your geographical features done. We've already worked on the graphic relief map. If you haven't finished that yet, you definitely need to get that finished up right away. The climate map is a little more recent. You should be putting the finishing details on that if you haven't finished yet, and the vegetation map as well. The climate and vegetation went along with that same chapter. Then in our chapter on industry, we talked about mineral resources. So you need to draw yourself a mineral resources map. Be finishing that up if you haven't done so already. And also a land use map that went along with our industrial chapter. Then for this chapter, you're going to have 3 additional maps, but you don't have to finish them by the end of the chapter. You'll have a little more time to work on them. It is our semester project, so as long as you get it done by semester's end. And our new maps are going to be a population map, a transportation map, and a political map. So let's take just a moment to look real quickly at these. Here is an example of a population map, and I'm pretty close so that you can see the key city, capital city, recreational site. There's a few extra things on this one, but the coloring is very important. 0 to 50 people per square mile. And we have 50 to 100 and 100 to 150 in different colors. And then also some statistics, average population per square mile, and average physiological density, which we'll be learning about during this chapter. And then we can just widen out a tad and let you get an idea how it's going to look. Notice it's the same outline that I've been showing you each time, and just shaded differently with the water features here. Okay, then this is an example of a transportation map. This one is not color-coded. You could color-code it, though, if you wanted to. Might make it look a little more pleasing, but you can see that there's a great deal of transportation here. Many things you need to keep in mind where you have cities, and also your transportation will need to go over mountains and things like that. It does look very busy, but notice all of the different things that are shown on this transportation map. Okay, we have roads, railroads, bridges, navigable rivers or lakes, airports, ports, international airport or port, air route, port route, lighthouse, radioactive power plant, wow, power line and telephone line. And we'll, communication does have to travel, so it's a form of transportation. Radio transmitter center, postal service, and also pipelines are actually a form of transportation. Oil travels and other items travel through pipelines. So all of those are depicted on this transportation map. And you'll need to consider your physical features as well when you're working on that map. And then the political map you're probably more familiar with. This student went a little above and beyond and included a flag, a symbol, and some information about the president and vice president. So those are some ideas for you. Now let's look at your assignment. You need to continue working on Geography Island. And did you find the answer to our question? What country owns the world's largest island? Denmark owns Greenland, the world's largest island. No new question for today. We'll have another one for you next time.